their story needs to be told, and needs to be told in museums and institutions, because they're inspiration for everybody. And that little boy was inspired 70 years later.
Welcome to episode 319 of Alberta Dugout Stories, the podcast. I'm Joe McFarland. Slowly but surely, the baseball season is coming alive, and this little reprieve from Old Man Winter has us dreaming about summer days at the ballpark, and even a few teams have been able to get out in what might be considered fake spring, or maybe spring is actually springing. Who knows as we enter March. We have a very special edition of the show this week as we mark Black History Month. We'll be sharing memories of two unforgettable teams, the Amber Valley Squad in Alberta and the Indian Head Rockets in Saskatchewan. But first, the news headlines. We'll start in the majors, where there hasn't been a lot of action involving Alberta products, aside from a trio of former Dogs. Tristan Peters has 2 hits in 5 at-bats and has scored a run in 3 games for the Tampa Bay Rays. Alejo Lopez has made an appearance in 4 games for the Athletics, hitting .500 with a double and an RBI. And Shea Shanneman saw his first spring training action on Tuesday, facing the final batter and getting the strikeout in a 6-1 Atlanta Braves win over the Boston Red Sox. No action yet for Calgary's Michael Soroka in Washington, Edmonton's Eric Sabrowski in Cleveland, or any of the multitude of players in the minors. It is still pretty early in spring training, though, so we'll keep you posted in the weeks ahead. To the college world now, and what a run it's been for Okotoks Dogs product, Connor Croson. He continues his torrid spring at the University of Montevallo. This past weekend, he homered 4 times, including one of the walk-off variety against Mississippi College.
Connor Croson lifts a ball deep to right center field. The Falcons win the ball game! Connor Croson, walk-off home run. The Falcons are waiting for him at the plate. They mob him. Falcons win the series.
Croson has been named the Gulf South Conference Player of the Week for his efforts. Not to be outdone, AHP alum Will Gardner had himself quite the Monday. He hit 3 homers and drove in 9 in 2 games for Mount Marty University against Peru State. He's now hitting .556 through 6 games. Calgary's Derry Steyert-Couture continues to rip it up with Cerro Coso Community College. He picked up 5 hits, including a homer and 2 walks with an RBI in 3 games over the weekend. He's hitting .366 with 2 homers and 10 RBI in 11 games. Weber Academy alum Dylan Chop has been named the Region 9 Player of the Week with Trinidad State for the week ending February 16th. He hit .533 with 3 doubles, a homer, and 4 RBI. He's hitting .340 on the campaign with 3 homers and 9 RBI in 15 games. On the Hill, Dogs Academy product Michael Yusupchuk's second start with Missouri State was, in a word, amazing. He threw 7 scoreless innings and a 3-1 loss to Mississippi State. He allowed just 2 hits and struck out 8 in what his coach says was one of the program's best ever starts for freshmen. The St. Albert native has also been named the Missouri State Student Athlete of the Week. AHP's Cole Huebner is back to his old ways with Indian Hills Community College. He tossed 5 scoreless innings, giving up just 2 hits and a walk in a 6-1 win over North Central Missouri. He also struck out 3 in that contest and is now 1-1 on the season. And how about the week for Saskatoon's Corey Waters? The Going Yard Academy alum had 10 hits, 3 walks, and 10 RBI on the week. Most impressively, the McCook Community College utility man went 4 for 4 with 3 dingers and a 15-2 win over Bismarck State. If that wasn't enough, he also started the game on the mound, going 4 hitless innings, striking out 10 of the 12 batters he faced, en route to being named the Canadian Baseball Network's College Player of the Week. On the commitment front, a couple to pass your way. Grand Prairie's Hayden Willette is heading to Minnesota North College Hibbing. He also attended St. Joe's Academy in Red Deer. And Calgary's Fraser Joseph is going to Lamar Community College in Colorado. He's a product of Weber Academy. In other news around the baseball world, the big one, of course, is Old Foothill Stadium in Calgary is on its way down finally. It's been talked about for years as the city has identified the site as the home for the much-needed field house. 3 excavators have quickly taken down the dugout, seating, and guts to the old facility, which was home to the Calgary Cardinals, Expos, Cannons, Outlaws, Vipers, Bucks, Dinos, and was actually the original home of what what is now the Okotoks Dogs, back when they were the Calgary Dogs, of course. Lots of memories have been reduced to rubble. We've been covering it a ton on social. We've written a story, and we'll be diving deeper into it on a future episode of the show, as well as a few more stories that we're planning out. Weber Academy is looking for volunteers as they get ready to host the Baseball Canada Women's 19U National Championships this summer. That'll be happening July 31st to August 3rd. Get in touch with Weber for more on that. And out of the WCBL, former Weyburn Beavers slugger and home run derby champion Nolan Machabrota has a new professional home. After spending the offseason working out at Going Yard Academy in his hometown of Saskatoon, he's heading to the Frontier League's Ottawa Titans. Now on to this week's guests, and as mentioned, we wanted to do something special as we continue to mark Black History Month each February. This year, we are honoring a pair of teams that captured the imaginations of baseball watchers in the early and mid-20th century. We'll start in Saskatchewan with the infamous Indian Head Rockets. Located about 70 kilometers east of Regina on the Trans-Canada Highway, the tiny community of just over 1,900 was among the many communities around the province that absolutely loved hosting tournaments. They drew teams from all over the place, and they were worth big money back in the day. Mayor Jim Robison headed up a committee to find the best players for his team and eventually courted the Jacksonville Eagles, a Negro Leagues team, and named them the Indian Head Rockets, who existed from 1950 to 1954. Robyn Jensen tells those stories through her Home Runs and Dirt Roads website and also runs the Indian Head Museum, and joined me recently for a great conversation about the team's history and her continued efforts in telling the team's tales.
Robyn, thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Joe. And it's so nice to actually meet you in person. We've been talking by email, and this is wonderful.
And you've been able to write some stories for us as well, which has been fantastic. And that's why we wanted to bring you on, because it is Black History Month. It's a chance for us to highlight the past. And one of those teams that's kind of, in my mind, integral to telling the story of baseball in the prairies, in Saskatchewan particularly, is the Indian Head Rockets. Give us a bit of the origin story for the team. Where did they sprout up from, and how long were they in existence for?
Yeah, and I'm just going to back up just a couple years before and just talk about, Indian Head and the tournaments that they used to hold in Saskatchewan during the late 40s, especially 48 and 49, which were some of our biggest ones, which kind of led up to how the Rockets came into our community. But, we held some of the biggest tournaments in Western Canada, a town of about 1,500 people in 1948 and 1949. Up to 30,000 people would come to this community to watch baseball. And it was just unbelievable. Like, where did they all come from? But there was a huge following of baseball. There were so many people that were passionate about it. And I think because of the success that, Indian Head had with these tournaments, the next natural step was to find a ball team that would represent our community and participate in these tournaments as well as hosting them. And so it really was a big incentive by the community. Jimmy Robison, he was our mayor. He was a business owner. Along with a young men's organization, sort of started talking about, maybe we want a team here. And I think, because our team was an all-black team from the United States, I think, we have a long history of Black ball players playing in this province, starting in the 1920s. You've written an article about John Donaldson coming up in 1925 and playing for Moose Jaw. And so I think, locals saw the talent of the ball players and said, you know what, I think we need to go south, and we need to go get a team. So he started conversations. So Jimmy started conversations with Ray Dumont, who is the founder of the National Baseball Congress. And there's sort of, from researching the papers, there's been sort of mention of Rogers Hornsby being involved. I don't know how that all kind of plays in. Rogers was sort of off in another direction. And, when Jimmy, he took a delegation down in 1950 to talk about bringing a ball team up here. So I'm not sure how that all went into play, but really was working with Ray. And a recommendation came up, and it was the Jacksonville Eagles out of Jacksonville, Florida, that said, hey, you know what, these guys would be good. Let's get them and bring them to Canada.
Take us into that first season, and how good was this team first off, and give us a few of the big names that maybe came up and suited up for the Indian Head Rockets.
Yeah, so the 1950 team that came up here, and really 1950 and 1951, I think were some of our best years and the best ball players. But these ball players, they were, Negro League players. One of the manager player of the Jacksonville Eagles was Big Jim Williams. And I've done some research on Big Jim, and he played with Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard in the Homestead Grays, like Negro League royalty, like that came up here and played in our little community. And so we had these elite players, and that first year, I think they were sort of just getting their footing. They did really well, but it was the 1951 that I really want to focus on. They had they had Chet Brewer end up joining the team. And if you know Chet was, up there with Satchel Paige. Of course, he didn't, get to the notoriety that Satchel did, but he was an extremely talented pitcher. We had him, we had Tom Alston, and we are proud to say as a community that and hosting these ball teams that we had two players that went on to the major leagues, and Tom Alston was one of them. Pumsey Green was another one, but Tom played in 1950 and 1951 for us. We had Pedro Azario, Jesse Blackman, just these incredible players playing for us. And, the 1951 year, I'm just looking at some stats here, but, they won 3 tournaments. They were the Western Canadian League champs, 22 game winning streak. Some of the top hitters of the season, Les Weatherspoon was a 419, Pedro was 395, like incredible, like just incredible. And, to have that talent playing in Indian Head and touring around on our behalf, like what an incredible honor. So to represent our community.
Really is interesting over the years thinking about the tournament schedule, right? Because you see some of those teams and those super teams that would come through and they go every couple of days to a new tournament and run the show, right? You mentioned 22 game winning streak. Like these were refined teams that represented small communities, but they were massive draws too.
Yeah, the tournaments, so many different levels, again, trying to peel the way of the onions of how like a tournament worked in a small community, how they were held, the tournament amounts. But really this, was the bread and butter for most of the teams for the season. I mean, the regular game league schedules, they didn't make money. The tournaments is where they made money. And this would cover like their travel costs, their payroll, their food, their expenses, everything. So competition was super high for these tournaments and to win them. And they would fit them in between the regular season and sometimes maybe even skip out on some regular season games just to go to these tournaments to win.
Talk a little about the evolution of that team. You talked about 50 and 51, but walk us through sort of the subsequent years and then what led to the ending of the Rockets.
Yeah, so the team, yeah, they were in our community from 1950 to 1954. And, I think from even the first year that the team came, I mean, they were plagued by financial problems. Like these players were getting paid a lot of money in our community. I think the first, when I was researching them, it was $6,000 or $7,000 that, the organization had to pay in payroll for these players to come up. That's a lot of money back in 1950. And so right from the very beginning, it was trying to sort of manage to put on a tournament, have these ball players like play across Saskatchewan and play at tournaments, and each year I think it was kind of building and building all of these financial pressures, and they ran in a deficit like every single year, and by 1954 it was just too much for them, and they had to dissolve. But yeah, 52 to 54, we had like Big Jim Williams. He was the manager from 1950 to 52. And then in 1953, he took the team and went to Regina, most of the team members. And then some of the other team members got scattered around the province playing for other teams. But in 1953 and 54, we had a barnstorming team called the Florida Cubans, and we hired them to play for the last 2 seasons. And how we got connected with the Florida Cubans was the cut priest Washington, and he was the owner of the Jacksonville Eagles. And he knew Jesse Richardson, who was the owner of the Florida Cubans, and they both played in the Southern Negro League down in Florida. So they were sort of rival teammates. And so when Cut Priest was talking with Jesse in 1952, because the Florida Cubans came up and played with us in 52, he said, well, why don't you come to Indian Head and come to Saskatchewan, because the tournament, purses, they're quite high. Like some of them would go up to like $6,500, which is a lot of money. So come to Saskatchewan, come to Indian Head. And so in 1952, we were actually home base for two teams, so both the Indian Head Rockets and the Florida Cubans. So we started the relationship with them back even in 52 as a community. And then in 53 and 54, then we hired them to play for us. So some of those members on that team, Roberto Barbon, he is a player who went on to have an illustrious career in Japan. If you know Roberto, we had Chico Farrow. He went down to Central America and he had a really long career playing as a coach down there. So, when I think of Indian Head and I think of some of these ball players, like we were sort of the stepping stone for some of these young guys that to go on and have like a really great career. And, we're really happy to be part of that story.
Take us into the racial side of things, because I know, and in reading, I believe it was your story about Jimmy, is he thought of, he was in Lloydminster with the Meridians for a while, and he became Mr. Baseball in the border city. He mentioned the fact that this was sort of like a safe refuge, right? Because you're not going into the heart of America where, even the color barrier barely been broken in Major League Baseball, as an example. They were facing a lot of that racial tension and racism in the States. What was it like here in Saskatchewan while they were barnstorming and playing for the Indian Head Rockets?
I think that's something that's, I'm trying to work through and trying to understand is sort of like their role as a ball player versus like the role of someone who's like, who settled here, or like, a Black person who was living here. And I think, baseball sort of put these players on a pedestal. And I mean, when you come into a community and they're representing you, you're going to treat them well, right? You're going to treat them like kings. You're going to treat them like heroes. And and they were given a lot of freedoms that, yeah, they didn't have down in the United States. Curly Williams, I think you're thinking of Curly,
Mhm.
who went and played for the Meridians. And he tells a story about how he would travel around as his teammates, and he would have to sit in the kitchen and eat his meals while his ball players, would sit in the restaurant area and eat. And he would cry about it because he felt it was so demeaning for him. And coming up to Canada on his way up to, he brought his family up, but he couldn't go into stores to buy diapers for his kids because he was Black and they wouldn't allow it. And so to come up here and to be put on the pedestal and to be treated like a king, and have all the freedoms to go and sit in the same restaurant and eat in the, with everybody else, Black, white, it didn't matter. It was incredible. And so many ball players came up multiple years just because of that, because they're treated like human beings up here.
It's an interesting juxtaposition that way, right? Because everybody considers Alberta, Saskatchewan as sort of I'll call it the redneck provinces to a certain extent. No, there's these things, that thing. I mean, we've been from what I can tell anyways, a pretty accepting couple of provinces especially when it comes to the baseball side of things. And hey, if you can play, you can play.
I think yes, if you're, when you're recognized as a ball player for sure. But I mean, there were some ball players that did have issues with racism. Roberto Zayas, if you know Roberto, he was from Cuba, and he came and played with the Saskatoon Gems, and then he ended up, because of the revolution in Cuba, he couldn't go back home in 59. So he ended up immigrating and settling in Saskatchewan and living in Moose Jaw. And put the baseball aside, as a man who's a black man in a small community trying to work, he had racism. Like he felt it. And George Reed, who was a football player, he also felt racism as well, living in Saskatchewan. So I think there's sort of this duo kind of like perceptions about, we can't pat ourselves on the back too much, because I think sports does elevate players to a point where, they put race aside, but it still is there. So we just have to be, mindful of that for sure.
Absolutely. Want to get into your personal interest in this particular team because, and we'll get into the cards in a second, but
Yeah.
take us to the very beginning. What was it about this team that made something in your mind click and go, I want to figure out more?
Yeah, so we live in Indian Head, and I'm not from this community. I've lived here for about 20 years with my husband and my daughters. And my oldest daughter was working at the museum as a summer student back in 2018. And she was there when Ken McCabe, and Ken ran the Rural Sports Hall of Fame in Indian Head for about 26 years. But Ken ran into some health problems, and he was sort of dissolving his sports hall, and so some of the memorabilia came over to to our museum. And so my daughter was there when Ken was bringing in some things regarding the Rockets, some original balls and photos and that kind of thing. And there was one photo, and it was of our ball diamond, and there was like, yeah, 20,000 people sitting around this ball diamond. And she came home and she's like, Mom, you'll never guess that we had this 20,000 people come to this town to play, to watch baseball. And I'm just like, in 1948, and I'm like, what is happening here? I need to find out more. So, so my interest in that just sort of like, I joined the museum and I started doing some research. And I have a background, I have an undergraduate in anthropology, and I love local history. I love learning about Saskatchewan history. So my interest was piqued. I had to find out more. And then COVID hit, and it's sort of, we took it as a glass half full opportunity. And so as I was researching and learning more about tournaments in our town and learning about the Rockets, we decided we wanted to renovate the main floor of our museum. And I said, this story has to be in the museum. Like, we have to put it forefront. And so 2021, 2022, it was very serendipitous, met some, people that just sort of helped this story go along, and everything sort of fell into place, and created an exhibit. And we found two living players, Nat Bates and Willie Reed. And then they were nominated to get inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And so I just feel like, and then sad things happened too. Like Ken McCabe, who I mentioned, passed away, and he was such a big part of the story, keeping it alive in our community. And I just thought, it's sort of that precipice where it's like, if we don't keep the story going, we're going to lose it. And I just wanted to just help it along. I feel like I'm just kind of this vessel where everything just sort of flows through, and, to try to keep the story going, and to learn as much as I can. So I really have sort of just taken it on, and it's sort of blossomed into lots of different things in my life. And I've met two great baseball mentors, Jay Delma from attheplate.com and Rich Necker, who have sort of taken me under their wing and teaching me about early baseball. And I'm very grateful for them, and started up kind of my own side research, home runs, dirt roads. And I've met so many wonderful ball players. I've really wanted to go and try and find as many stories as possible. So I've been interviewing as many ball players from that era as possible. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. So,
It's had to been kind of almost frustrating to a certain extent too. You and I were talking off air about this, is the fact that as the years go on, you kind of alluded to it, you start losing some of those voices. You've only got two members of the original team that are still with us. And how challenging is that trying to track down not just, the players, but also trying to find family members and those who might have been in attendance in games and that kind of thing, just to paint a more accurate picture of what the scene was like back in 1950, 51, 52, 53, etc.
Yeah, and I think it's my love for research. I think it's sort of like a challenge that I like to take on, but it's really just starting at one point and working your way back and reaching out to, like, we have a wonderful baseball community in Saskatchewan, Jane Sheary at the Saskatchewan Sports Hall of Fame. She's like a vessel of knowledge. So give Jane a call, see if she knows somebody, and literally looking in the internet phone book and like or phoning like a town village, and it's like, hey, do you know so and so, and like try and get connected with them that way. It's like, and I think that's the Saskatchewan way too. It's like,
Mhm.
you just, it's we're so just approachable that way, that we can still do that, where we can phone the town office and like get a hold of somebody and and then it's like, do you know this person, or do you know this person? And so really it's been kind of through that method that I've been able to connect with different ball players. So
It's gotta be like hitting a home run when you do find that little nugget, eh? Every time you get a chance to connect with, whether it's a child of one of the players, that kind of stuff, and just getting to hear their story has gotta feel like just a weight off your shoulders to a certain extent, because you probably put in a lot of work behind the scenes to try to get to that person, but then to have them open up and tell their story has got to be something else.
it is. And one person I do have to mention, and his name is Dr. Sherman Cottingham, and he's not an Indian Head Rocket, and he came to Saskatchewan later in the 60s, but Dr. Cottingham played for the North Battleford Beavers in 1964 and 65. And he was a protege of Satchel Paige. Like,
Okay.
Sherman was a pitcher, and and Satchel saw him pitch, and he's like, I need you to come play for my team. And so in 1963, Sherman played for the All Stars, Satchel Paige's All Stars. And so again, another connection to this, like, Negro League elite players. And I mean, Satchel came to Saskatchewan, of course, many times as well. And that's how we nabbed Sherman, was when Satchel came up in his barnstorming in '63, and Kenny Nelson saw Sherman and said, "Hey, you should come play for us." So he did. But listening to Sherman talk about growing up in Louisiana, this dirt poor, and pulling himself up, and using baseball, and then eventually he went into education, and that was sort of the path he took. He didn't pursue baseball too much after his 20s. And but to talk about his relationship with Satchel, and Satchel teaching him these pitches, and it's so surreal, and it's an honor and a privilege to listen to him. So yeah.
Do you find yourself taking yourself back into an era that you didn't get to live through? And by that, I mean, I say this with Ian all the time, is can you imagine being there when Satchel Paige is throwing in a random small town community at a tournament, or watching the Indian Head Rockets live? Do you take yourself into those moments and try to imagine it almost?
Absolutely. It's one of a big thing is like just to try and understand the culture that the ball players played in the 1950s, and to figure out like how an all black team was accepted in all these small communities who were predominantly white, and like the interactions that were going on between the ball players and the community after the games. And yeah, so it's that is a huge part of it, because it's to understand that is to understand their experiences as well. So I think one of the most interesting conversations I had was with John Ford, who was an American, and he came up, a college kid from California, and came up and started playing in the 50s for Moose Jaw, and then ended up in North Battleford. And he met a girl in North Battleford, and ended up marrying her, and stayed, and he retired in Saskatoon. And to listen I had both of them at the table. I had both him and Bev at the table to listen to how, what was Bev's life like when John was on the road. And one of the things that really stood out for me is like, I said, how did you guys communicate when you were on the road? And they said, well, we didn't, because back then when you had to phone, you used the landline, but you had to call collect, and it was a lot of money. So we didn't call collect. So how Bev would sort of keep track of John was just listening to the ball games on the radio, and you just don't think about that these days, right?
Looking at it from the standpoint of being in Indian Head now and being able to curate what you've curated to this point, what's that Rockets legacy mean to the community now that you've been able to kind of envelop it and understand and maybe bring that story to life for them now?
Yeah, and I think this came to fruition for me when we did the exhibit opening in 2022, and we had sort of a round table where we invited local community members to come and share their stories, or just to come and to learn about the Rockets. And so we had sort of an age range where, they're in their 80s now, but they were kids when they came. When the Rockets were here in the 50s and they were watching the games. And I think one of the things that really stood out for me was how these men were seen as heroes to these kids, and it was girls and boys. They would come and watch these players and go, oh my gosh, like I want to be just like them. And to have that sort of like representation of, sort of inclusive representation, and it didn't matter like skin color, and maybe them coming into our community was a way of opening up people's eyes and going, hey, it doesn't matter, like they can play, they're great people, and they were part of our community. They lived, downtown during the summertime. They went to dances, they went to Jimmy Robison's house and played instruments, and they would go golfing in the valley together. And, so I think just hearing that from that time period, especially when segregation, you were hearing horror stories about segregation in the United States, and even in our own history with, residential schools and that kind of thing. Like, I think it just creates hope, right? It's just that, these scenarios did happen, and it was good. So yeah. And so the legacy is like inspirational that, you know, I'll share one more story. I have so many,
Mhm.
but in the exhibit, there was this little boy and his mom that came in, and he was African Canadian descent little boy. He was about 6 years old, and he's going through these other exhibits and he's not paying attention really. And then he comes to the baseball exhibit and he stops and he fixates on Pumpsy Green. And Pumpsy Green was our other Rocket that went on to play for the majors, and he was a friend of Nat Bates and Willie Reed, one of our last two living Rockets. And so he stops and he's fixated on Pumpsy, and he goes, "Mom, come here." And she's like, "What?" And she's like, "He has the same name I do, which was Elijah." And he said, "And he looks like me." And that that made me cry, and it made her mom cry too, because there isn't a lot of representation in museums and institutions of people of African descent. And so to have that there, I think that's their legacy, is that their story needs to be told, and needs to be told in museums and institutions, because they're inspiration for everybody. And that little boy was inspired 70 years later.
Absolutely. And you're doing your best to make sure that that story is told in a multitude of ways. I want to get to the baseball cards for a second. Where did this idea come from? Where are you at in the process now? And I know it's 75 years, right? Like that's a big point of this. So talk us through the evolution of this little side project amongst a variety of side projects that you have with the Indian Head Rockets.
Yeah, and again, it's like sort of serendipitous that the story came when it came to me, and came to our community, because there's so many milestones that are happening. And we realized that 2025 is the 75th anniversary of their inaugural year. So it was like, okay, we got to do something. We got to do a few things. And of course, we're all volunteers at the museum. We're not we're not paid, and so we have to work on projects that everybody's on board for. But The baseball cards came because actually of my daughter. So she's involved in designing the 2018 students. She's grown up and she's been to school and she's got some skills now. And so she's designing the baseball cards. She's volunteering her time to do that. And then I've been working with all of December. I worked with Jay Dell and Rich, and we researched and got all the information, all the stats and figures for the backs of the cards. And yeah, it's been a wonderful and crazy. I don't know if I could do it as a job doing baseball cards. It's a lot of work. So, but this is just a great way to honor the Rockets and share their story and their history in a fun way, not, through baseball cards, because it appeals to everybody. It'll appeal to collectors, it'll appeal to kids, it'll appeal to, just it's a different way to share history, I guess, right? And so the cards are going to have like little stories. They'll have, tidbits of their each year. We'll have, a 1950 card, 1951 card, talks about like key players, and talks about Nat and Willie. So we've got about 36 cards in development right now, and we're going to have them ready for the summer, and hopefully sell them a little bit as a fundraiser too. So
Very cool. Well, kudos on that project and kudos on all of your fantastic work with the Indian Head Rockets. I have one final question for you. It's a bit of a spin on my usual last question. What has the Indian Head Rockets meant to you?
oh my gosh. Yeah, I kind of get emotional when I think about it, because I think, these players, I don't know if I've sort of embraced them as family. And I know one of the things that I want to learn about is their life stories, beyond the ball diamond. Because of the time that they grew up, it's so important to understand that these ball players defied the odds, and there were so many things working against them, back, during segregation, and a time when they had to fight for everything. Like there's a story with Herbert Barnhill, and he was one of the players, and he said, we had to be our own managers. We had to go out there and we had to pound the pavement. We had to make connections. We had to, because there was no one doing it for us. And I think, it just puts it into perspective. I think when you're having a bad day and you think, oh my gosh, like what these players had to go through to do something that they loved, it was absolutely incredible. And so my way of like honoring them is just to learn about them and to share their stories, and so that they can continue to inspire people as they continue to inspire me. Because every time I learn something new about them, I'm just in awe, and so that's how it's sort of affected me.
An absolute honor to be able to tell just a small snapshot of the work that you've been doing and a small snapshot of what Indian Head Rockets meant to that community. So, Robyn, really appreciate all the hard work that you've been putting into it. Really appreciate your time being able to tell a little bit of the story. And thank you again so much for being game to come on the show here today.
Oh, and thank you so much. And like, I do have to do a shout out to you and Ian for all of your work as well. Like, you are really building a community here in Saskatchewan. You're sort of becoming a hub to kind of pool everybody together. And I think it's really exciting what you guys are doing. And I can't wait to see what else you guys do. So yeah, so thanks for having me on.
Next up is the Amber Valley Baseball Club. Located about 160 kilometers north of Edmonton, the tiny community of just 300 became one of several where early black immigrants settled from Oklahoma and the Deep South. In 1926, a man named J.D. Edwards started the team to play against others in northern Alberta. They quickly became known for their skill, style, and swagger, entertaining large crowds everywhere they went. Nearly 100 years later, the team captured the attention of Chris L. Butler, a writer who had followed a similar journey from the South to Alberta. Now living in Ontario, I had the chance to sit down for a great conversation with him about his love of baseball, the Negro Leagues, and his fascination with Amber Valley.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Give us the origin story through your eyes of the Amber Valley baseball team.
Totally. So Amber Valley's baseball team is a lot like Amber Valley's community. It's a lot of Black folks who migrated, immigrated, however you want to define it, specifically out of Oklahoma and Texas a little bit into Alberta. And these folks did not necessarily want to be in Edmonton area where Amber Valley is. They didn't necessarily come with the idea of Canada. It was more like get out of the US. And I think a lot of Black Americans at that time were looking to self-define, not just as identity goes, but as community goes, as business goes. So you see in the area they fled, Black Wall Street comes like about 17, 17 or so years after this migration in 1907. So it's very interesting because I think the baseball team was started in a lot of the same ways. Like, let's do something for us as Black folks in Canada, in this new community. And it's no coincidence that Jefferson J.D. Edwards, a notable resident, immigrant to Canada from the U.S. in this group, he was very much one of those movers and shakers in the Amber Valley community. And, he was the one that got the team off the ground. I wouldn't look at them like the Philadelphia Stars, like an official Negro League team. I would look at them more like your barnstorming teams that were across the United States, Canada, Mexico, even Cuba. These teams were really about the love of the game. They have a lot in common with amateur sports, but it was players that weren't always amateur. We're talking the MLB started in 1800s with Cincinnati and the Yankees. So very much baseball was a pickup game, regardless of race at that time. And I think these barnstorming teams were about that. I think they were inspired by the Negro Leagues down in the States from Rube Foster, the founder of that.
Looking at that roster, give us a couple of names that stood out to you. The ones that were like, man, those were the stars of the day.
I hear a lot about Alvin Brown, Cliff Brown. I think they were brothers. I haven't actually verified that information, but given the close knitness of the Amber Valley community, I would say they were related in some fashion. There's also Alonzo Moose Edwards. I've often wondered, was he Afro-Latino American? Was he just a Black American with a Latino name? That's also a thing sometimes. I have a British name, but I'm certainly not British. And I think that name comes from Greek folks originally. But other names like Booker T. Edwards, Kenny Edwards, I do believe they were brothers. Horace Forty Hilton, Oswald Peepsight, Lipscomb, and Arthur Mann Sanders. I would say those are the names that are in the rotation the most.
For sure. I've read a lot about this team, and it seems as though a couple of words really kind of stick out to me: competitive and swagger. How
Yeah.
good were they, and how much of a show do you think they might have put on back in the day?
Well, I do believe all barnstorming baseball teams and Negro League teams, whether official or de facto, were more exciting personally than Major League Baseball. I am a fan of both, but I've done quite a bit of historical research on this. And I think, like anything, when we're diverse, we're stronger, right? And with segregated leagues, you have a limited competition on both sides.
Yeah.
But because of the unofficialness of a lot of these teams, there was a lot more excitement. I know for a fact the Negro Leagues brought stealing bases into Major League Baseball. That wasn't even a thing. So think about that stationariness of Major League Baseball at the time versus this quick, fast pace. Of course, there's an athleticism element there, but also really it's almost kind of like the Savannah Bananas of today, where it's baseball on someone else's terms and really about exciting. But the Savannah Bananas are about exciting the fan. I think this is more about exciting each other and the community.
I've heard a lot of stories too about the crowds and how they became a draw. That certainly seemed to be the case with Amber Valley as well.
Yeah, I believe that one thing that's really interesting about this team is they're called the Calgary Black Sox,
Hmm.
but they weren't in Calgary,
Hmm.
They very rarely played in Calgary. They actually played more games in Saskatchewan than Southern Alberta. But from the plays I've seen about Amber Valley, by Cheryl Fogo, and also just the things I've talked to her and other folks about, it was the pride of the community. And I do believe, like a lot of the Negro Leagues teams, they drew in non-black spectators. And the beauty in that is there's an intimacy with that crowd that can't be replicated in a giant stadium like Rogers or
Hmm.
Citizens Bank Park in Philly. Even Yankee Stadium in all its might, it's these games were, imagine like a ballpark in your community with, and people are just, and like hundreds of people show up. That's the it adds a different flair. These weren't people buying tickets. These were people really there for entertainment. I mean, we're talking the 1920s. There's no technology anywhere near to what we have. So folks wanted to be in their communities. They wanted to see their friends at the highest level of competition.
Do you find yourself when you're looking back on that team almost wanting to travel back in time just to witness it, just to experience what it had been like in those days to see kind of the barnstorming spectacle that would have been that Amber Valley baseball team?
That's such a great question because I've thought about that a lot. Like, what time would I like to go back to? And I often answer the Harlem Renaissance.
Mhm.
However, ever since discovering Amber Valley, the community, and this team, I realized that's actually where I'd like to go because 100 years later in 2020, I immigrated from the U.S. to Canada, out of Texas, where some of these folks came from, and that's not where I'm not originally from Texas, but I lived there at the time, and it's cool to see. Part of the reasons I left were the current president, who's now president again. I did not enjoy time there. My wife's Canadian. It just seemed like a natural new beginning and a great opportunity, and that's also what drew me to this. Researching this baseball team and Amber Valley, I saw myself in these folks beyond race. I saw myself in experience connected to race, sure, but I felt like I was continuing the path that they journeyed. And so now I say I'd love to go back to that time, and I wonder. I'm sure it'd be really cold, but I'd love to, see Amber Valley in the 1920s. Absolutely.
Mhm. Give us the backstory on how you even came upon this story in the first place and what maybe inspired you to say in 2021, I want to write about this and get the story into the spotlight a little bit through my own channels.
Absolutely. I think what got me here starts out with growing up. I grew up in Philadelphia, a very historical town, and we're one of the best places for murals. I often say we are the mural city. I'm sure lots of people would disagree, but that's my bias.
Mhm.
And growing up, I saw in West Philly where I grew up, there were murals of the Philadelphia Stars and Negro League baseball players and Jackie Robinson and all these different things. Muhammad Ali lived in my part of West Philly when he was Cassius Clay, training as a boxer. So I grew up seeing these murals, and I grew up in a historical town. And I think that always made me a lover of history. I have my bachelor's degree in history from the University of Houston, and I'm a huge baseball fan, Phillies fan, and I often heard my mom say that my grandfather was a Braves fan because at the time, Philly had two baseball teams. The Philadelphia Athletics and the Philadelphia Phillies came a few years later, and those teams were unfortunately racist fan environments, like a lot of places. So my grandfather he was a Negro League fan, but he also really liked the Milwaukee Braves because they had black players, right? Hank Aaron. And I had this. I never knew my grandfather, but I had this passion to dig back into that time. And when I was at the University of Houston, I for my junior thesis, I did a lot of work on the Jim Crow era. And one specific thing I really dove deep into was the Negro League. And I learned about Rube Foster. I actually collect some Negro League things. I have a jacket with all the team logos. I have a baseball that Buck O'Neill played with at the Kansas City Monarchs. And I really grew passionate about this. And when I came to Calgary as an immigrant, I started learning about what are the black folks that came, and I didn't even know about all these black folks that came to Alberta, and it just was like this treasure chest of gems of knowledge. And I kept digging and digging. Because I'm a writer, I connected with some folks at the Sprawl, the independent Alberta media outlet, and Jeremy Clausis. He knew I was a baseball fan. He's their editor in chief. And he approached me and was like, I would love to work on this with you. And we went into the newspapers.com archives, which is a part of ancestry.com. We just started digging, and then I wrote the story. It's republished on Medium, but it was originally published on Afros in the City, where I used to write. And yeah, the rest is kind of history. No pun intended.
Did it surprise you at all, I guess, to a certain extent? Like we talked earlier about, whether it's the Black Sox as an example in the 20s, or Amber Valley, or even later on when you see Satchel Paige and John Donaldson and all these guys making their way to Canada of all places.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a bit of a shock to the system for a guy from Philly?
No, because I always heard good things about Canada. Of course, Ontario is very close to Pennsylvania. Part of it borders each other, between the lakes and stuff. And, I always heard good things about Canada. I went to Niagara Falls. I saw Canada not only as a place that maybe Black folks could go for a safe haven, but really American. There are a lot of folks I've heard about that were draft dodgers, which as a pacifist, I'm not against, that are now Canadians. I've got friends who their grandparents were like that. So it's really interesting to see. If you look at Canada's history, and I didn't go to Canadian school, so my history is limited, but if you look at what I've dug into Canada's history, there's times of folks coming, and it being a safe haven for famous people and the Amber Valley community and all these other types of communities, like Oliver Bowen. He came to Calgary. I believe he's a descendant of the Amber Valley community, but moved to Calgary, and he helped develop the C train. So it's something that I've always seen, as well as Cuba. I think even the Soviet Union at the time, you have got Paul Robeson going over there. France brought a lot of African Americans. So, unfortunately, despite all the tragic labor that we had to do through slavery, America was not very friendly to us, as you know. And I'm grateful for countries like Canada and Cuba and the former Soviet Union, even because a lot of these people that we herald, that is a part of their journey, going to another country. W.E.B. Du Bois had to go to Germany and was there during the Third Reich. So yeah, it's interesting to see all these different things happening across the world, and Canada and other countries opening their borders to Black Americans.
How much of a rabbit hole do you find yourself going down when it comes to not just the baseball side, but just the life side, right? Because you think about, to your point, everybody's got a different journey, but man, there's so many layers to the onion that you can kind of peel away, can't you?
Yes, it, whether it's Amber Valley or Oliver Bowen, or even John Ware to an extent, the information is very limited. Of course, John Ware has way more, but the information even on him, I believe, is limited. I think a lot of these folks were just surviving. It's very much a part of the Black American life, even today. My family back home surviving a lot right now, you know? And I think with all our famous folks, we sometimes forget about folks just want to be regular people, you know, and live their lives. So I don't think whether it was John Ware and Amber Valley, you know, Jefferson Edwards, being the person who started the team and getting things off the ground, like I think they were just living, you know, and in a way that makes it super hard to dive in. You know, there's not the breadth of information that we have on like Malcolm X. You know, there's that you could get a dissertation and a PhD specifically on Malcolm X, but if you were to bring an Amber Valley project to a PhD program, it would very much be new research. A lot of the things I've written are some of the only things you find if you're not accessing these newspaper databases. But once you get into these databases, there is all these little random clippings, and you read a name, and you're like, you might find their obituary, and then you figure out, oh, this person was Black, and then you go back and you know, because in Canada, they don't necessarily look at race the same way. It's just like you're Canadian, you know, for a lot of people. Maybe now we're talking about it, but back then, especially, you're just Canadian.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, wow. And then you start digging and you're like, what else can I find? What else can I find? And what's so cool about Alberta Black history, specifically from the African American diaspora there, is they're doing things that a lot of people couldn't do sometimes in the US, but they're also doing things that are just living, you know. So you're not going to find, you'll find a roster, you'll find a score here or there, but they weren't writing a history of their team. They were just having a good time. And I think that's the most important thing for Black people. To me, part of freedom is being so free you can just have a good time, you know?
Absolutely. It's unfortunate too, given when time passes, we end up losing a lot of those voices or those people who would have been able to share the stories from that. So in your eyes, how important is it to be able to tell these stories and document them? We're living in an internet age where, you know, back in the day, they didn't have the interweb, they didn't have social media, they didn't have these tools that allow us to maybe keep these stories getting told over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's such a good point. To that, I say I'm so grateful to Cheryl Fogo because, you know, Joe, she not only has she been very kind to the Black community and Canada, but she spent a lot of her time telling these stories, you know, using plays, books, documentaries, right? On John Ware, Amber Valley. Like, she really is a treasure, you know? And I've told her this. She's a friend of mine. I hope she gets to listen to this. And, you know, she's always supported my writing. I'm truly grateful for her because she doesn't have to do this. You know, she could do whatever she wants with her art. She's that talented and she knows that. But she chose, these people are her family, right? They're her ancestors. They're her greater community. Even though she's Calgary, she descends from these people, you know? And she is spending her entire creative output to tell these stories. And I think creativity can as much as I love reading the history book, there's something special about creative license and a creative outpouring that will gander a larger audience. You know, an academic journal is amazing, but it can't do what a documentary can, you know? And if you don't like documentaries, there's a book. And if you don't like books, there's a play. Like, she's got something for everyone. And one thing I've learned from her is I'd like to tell some of the stories of my family in my, you know, in my creative output, because what she's doing is she's not just taking the most important stories, she's telling all the stories.
Speaking of stories, do you see yourself diving back into the Amber Valley story again anytime soon?
Yes, actually, I would. I would love to. I've wrestled with a few different ideas. Um, I do write poetry, but I think what I'd really like to do is take my historical background and my writing skills and write a short story or a novel. And Amber Valley is something that comes top to mind for me. Um, that's something I've definitely wrestled with for a while because I want to tell the right story. I don't just want to retell my article. I want it to feel like you're a part of the large crowd that you described earlier in this conversation.
Absolutely. By the way, stay tuned because I get the feeling there's something going to be percolating in Chris's mind before too long. Final question for you. When looking back on Amber Valley and looking back on that, what kind of impact did their story have on you as you look back and dig through the archives?
Yeah, as an American immigrant and a Black American immigrant, I'm not your most common immigrant to Canada. Most people immigrate to the U.S. Versus immigrating out of the U.S. And sometimes, while I'm grateful, for the Black community that I'm a part of in Canada, in Calgary, and now in Hamilton, where I live, I'm also sometimes, alone. Like there's lots more Nigerians, there's lots more Somalians, there's lots more Jamaican, and I'm grateful for that. They deserve, those communities deserve that. But I don't often run into other Black Americans. America's so diverse. I've probably run into one of every type of race from America, and I think sometimes that can be a little lonely. Just being honest with you. My wife's not Black either. She's Indian. So while we have a happy, wonderful marriage, she doesn't necessarily have the lived experiences that I have, nor do I have the South Asian lived experiences. So there's always a lot of listening and learning. And when I found the Amber Valley story, I was able to find myself because I loved the Negro Leagues so much. And I was able to think of my grandfather, and I was able to think about his love for the Philadelphia Stars and how much more organized they were with, and how amazing Rube Foster was to be able to bankroll this as a Black man at the time, from Texas at that, like unfathomable in some ways, and I was able to find those folks in Alberta, where I immigrated 7 months. No, excuse me. I immigrated 2 months before the pandemic, and I had been in Canada off and on for 7 months prior. So I had a taste of Canada, but really fast things changed, and there was a lot of time in lockdown, and that kind of made it even more a little bit hard and lonely in that way. And I was able to connect. I think history is so important to connect, not only for your knowledge, but for your ancestors, right? And even though I'm not directly related to these folks in the way Cheryl Fogo is, I felt empowered and I felt like they were distant kin.
Fantastic. Well, really appreciated you trying to tell their story through your piece 4 years ago, and can't wait to see what might be next coming down the pike for you, whether it be in the Amber Valley baseball team world or elsewhere, because you do some fantastic writing, Chris. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
And thank you, Joe, and thank you to Alberta Dugout Stories for having me.
Thanks again to Robyn Jensen and Chris L. Butler for joining us on the show this week to help spread the word about the Indian Head Rockets and the Amber Valley baseball team. We truly appreciate their insights and the ability to elevate these kinds of stories here on the show and on our site. Thanks as well to all of you for downloading and listening. We'd also like to thank our latest BuyMeACoffee.com campaign supporter, Dina Samer, who was quite generous with her donations, saying that she loves what we're doing for Saskatchewan and the sport, and she says, keep growing. That's exactly the goal, Dina. And thank you again so much for your support. If you'd like to help us out, head to buymeacoffee.com/dugoutstories. We have a couple of ideas that will soon be coming to fruition, so stay tuned. As always, tip of the cap to our platinum supporters, the Okotoks Dogs, Under the Light Sports and Entertainment, and the Western Canadian Baseball League for all they do for us and for baseball in Alberta and Saskatchewan. For more on our tremendous teammates, head to albertadugoutstories.com/supporters. Before I let you go, just a heads up that we're working on a couple of special editions of the show, and we'll likely have 2 next week, so hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a moment of the action. Until then, thank you for all of your support online, on social, and on air of Alberta Dugout Stories.